7 minutes, Madame la Présidente.
Excellent. Minister, thank you for coming here today. And in my community, we're nearing an anniversary in the next few weeks of the loss of someone who was a youth leader, a mentor, and someone who worked with the Boys and Girls Club. And his loss was important for the Eastview community, the Blake Boltby community, and the person I'm talking about is Kempton Howard. And it will be 15 years from the time that we lost him in a few weeks. And I raise that because I have worked with his mother. She's been a fearless advocate on gun issues and on gun violence issues, and someone who really has become a strong leader in our community. And I have helped her to work on some petitions that she's put forward on these issues. And I was hoping that with you here, I might be able to ask about what our government is doing in respect of some of the things that she has put forward in these petitions. The first one is that she's concerned about where the guns come from, and how do we prevent the flow from guns coming over the border from the United States. And so one of the requests that she has put forward in her petitions has been to see more support for the Canadian Border Services Agency to be able to prevent these guns from coming illegally across our borders. And I was wondering if perhaps you could let us know about what our government is doing to address that.
Thank you very much, Julie. I'll try to be brief so that, because I want to be respectful of everyone's limited time. First of all, I know June Howard and her son, and was involved in that investigation. And you're right, she's a compelling advocate, as so many mothers who have lost their children are. I think that's a voice we cannot ignore. With respect to where the guns are coming from, one of the things that we did very carefully in Toronto when I worked there, we examined the origin of every crime gun that came into our possession, and we were able to identify its origin in most cases. And they came essentially from two sources. We live next to one of the largest handgun arsenals in the world, and guns are smuggled across the border from the United States. There are individuals, but quite often criminal organizations responsible for that. And I will tell you, and perhaps I'll even refer to the RCMP and CBSA are here, but there are integrated border enforcement teams. There are very important comprehensive investigations, complex investigations taking place into the organizations responsible for that. But we also recognize, that you can't just do that work at the border. It requires work on both sides of the border, and that's why we have integrated border enforcement teams. We saw some success recently with CBSA working in partnership with the Toronto Police, where they seized about 22 firearms, I believe, John? 21 firearms that were secreted in a gas tank coming across the border. So that's an important source of guns coming into Canada that are used for criminal purposes. The other source of guns that had been identified was illegal diversion from the domestic market. And that can happen at a number of different points. It can happen at point of sale. And for example, there were investigations that I've been involved in where an individual, for example, went out and bought 77 handguns. He purchased them having the appropriate licenses and authorities required to acquire those guns, but he almost immediately ground the serial numbers off and sold them at a significant profit into the criminal realm. And they were used very quickly in criminal acts, and we recovered them at violent criminal offenses and traced them back to him. He went to jail for about 8 years. That's one of the ways. We've also seen a number of instances where firearms are stolen from either break-and enters or from cars. A case just in the past week in East Saskatchewan, where someone broke into a home and stole 77 restricted and prohibited firearms, 73 of which were handguns. All of those guns are now in the hands of criminals and available. And so it's quite frankly, there's no one simple thing to be done. Everything needs to be done. And so we need to ensure that we invest significantly in the investigative bodies and the access to the technologies and new tools and new methodologies and techniques that CBSA has been investing in, and I've been monitoring very carefully, and John's here with me and can tell you perhaps about some of the things they're doing, but they're significantly enhancing their capacity to detect. I think equally importantly, they're working very collaboratively with law enforcement through the integrated border enforcement teams and other types of joint force initiatives. As we saw recently in Toronto, those are really effective in identifying some of those individuals. And we are looking at a number of different measures on which we can make it more difficult for guns in any method, either smuggled across the border or illegally diverted from the domestic market to get into the hands of criminals. But I also want to say, because I think it's something that Ms. Howard's often raised with me as well, we have a lot of work to do to make sure that we reduce the demand for guns within that young community of young men who so often use them to commit violent acts. So it's just not a matter of interdicting the supply.
Actually, you're leading to where I was going to go with my next question, because that's a part that's also part of the petitions she's put forward. And I was actually reading a quote from what the person who was in fact found guilty for the shooting had said. And in his statement, he said, "If I hadn't been involved in guns, or if I hadn't had a gun on me, this would never have happened. I thought before that having a gun made me safe. Now I realize no one is safe when so many have a gun." And that's a quote from the person who had shot her son. And Joan Howard has also focused very much on how do we make sure that youth don't turn to guns and to violence as their options. So perhaps maybe I only have a minute left, but if you could let me know a bit more about what we're doing to make sure that youth do not make those choices.
As I said in my opening remarks, of $327.6 million in new funding, over $200 million over a 5-year period is available through the provinces and territories to work with community organizations and community groups. Now, I think those types of investments are important, and they are specifically focused on people who might perhaps be at risk of getting involved in violent criminal activity. But there are other investments as well, because, we look at the social determinants of violence in our communities, and it's often things like lack of access to opportunity and jobs and poor housing and lack of access to mental health services. And so it's a whole of government response. If we're going to deal effectively, and that is our intention, we have to look at all of those things, make significant investments in community and in young people, and to support those organizations that are doing exceptional work, as well as law enforcement who have the important job of upholding our laws and keeping our people safe.
Merci. Merci.